He noticed a change before he had proof. That was the part that haunted him later. The instinct that spoke before evidence ever did. She used to come home before dark, her keys jangling in the same careless rhythm she'd had since high school. Now, the door opened quietly, almost cautiously, as if she were entering someone else's house. Her laughter had thinned. Her phone never left her hand. When he asked simple questions, how was work? Did you eat? Her answers came clipped, rehearsed, eyes fixed anywhere but his face. He told himself it was adulthood, privacy, independence. He told himself fathers weren't meant to understand everything. But the silence between them grew heavier each night, stretching across the dinner table like a third presence. He could feel it pressing into his chest, the way unspoken things always did. He had lived his life believing that truth, once exposed, had a way of correcting itself. Lies were rot. Secrets were poison. You confronted them, or they consumed you. That belief had never failed him before. The night he crossed the line began like any other. Rain against the windows. The television murmuring in the background. She had gone to shower. Her phone left charging on the kitchen counter. It vibrated once. Then again, the screen lit up with a name he didn't recognize. He didn't touch it at first. He stood there, drying his hands on a dish towel, telling himself that decent men respected boundaries, that fathers didn't spy, that love required restraint. The phone vibrated again. A message preview slid across the screen, too fast, too brief, but long enough. You can't tell him. He wouldn't understand. His breath caught. The room felt suddenly smaller, the air thicker. He picked up the phone, his hand steadier than he expected. There was no password. That, too, would later feel like an accusation. The messages weren't explicit. They didn't need to be. Familiarity bled through every line. Private jokes, late-night check-ins, concerned master's control. Dates match nights she'd come home late. Phrases echoed things she'd said aloud, as if rehearsed somewhere else first. At the top of the thread was a title, not a name. Warden. The word hit harder than any insult. Authority. Power. Someone who understood rules, and how to bend them. When she returned, towel around her shoulders, she froze at the sight of the phone in his hand. For a moment, neither of them spoke. In that silence, years of trust trembled. "Give that back," she said finally. Her voice wasn't angry. It was afraid. "Who is he?" asked quietly. She shook her head. "You don't get to ask that." "I'm your father," he said. "I get to protect you." Her eyes filled, not with relief, but with something closer to panic. "You don't understand what you're doing." That was when he realized, whatever this was, it was already bigger than them. He believed exposure would end it. He believed truth would bring safety. As she turned away, retreating into her room, he didn't see it yet, but the line had already been crossed. And somewhere beyond the walls of that house, someone with far more power than either of them had just been threatened. Sleep never came that night. The house stayed awake with him. Pipes ticking, the refrigerator humming, the rain thinning into an uneasy drizzle. Her bedroom door remained closed. He stood outside at once, hand raised, then lowered it again. Whatever he had seen on that phone had shifted something fragile between them. Pushing now would only splinter it further. By morning, she was gone before he woke. No goodbye, no note, just an empty chair at the table and a cold cup of coffee left untouched. The words stayed with him as he moved through the day, echoing in his thoughts like a locked gate he couldn't open. Warden. It wasn't a name. It was a position, a role designed to command obedience and silence. The more he thought about it, the more unsettled he became. Men like that didn't drift casually into private lives. They didn't form attachments without understanding the power they held. He told himself he needed context, not conclusions. By afternoon, he had done what he rarely did. Search quietly, deliberately, public records, news articles, institutional announcements. The prison sat less than an hour away, a gray structure that barely registered on most maps. Its warden, however, was easy to find, commended for discipline, praised for reform initiatives, quoted in interviews about order, structure, control. The face staring back from the screen was composed, and unreadable. A man practiced in authority, comfortable being watched. He closed the browser, a hollow sensation spreading through his chest. There was no scandal attached to the name, no warning signs that would make this simple. If anything, the record suggested safety, respectability. That made it worse. When she finally came home that evening, he waited. He didn't raise his voice. He didn't accuse. He asked questions the way he always had. Slowly, carefully, believing patience could still bridge the gap. "Is he someone you work with?" he asked. She avoided his eyes, setting her bag down with deliberate care. "It's not what you think. That's what people say when it is." Her shoulders tensed. "You shouldn't have looked at my phone. I shouldn't have had to." The silence that followed felt heavier than before, weighted with things she wasn't ready to say. Finally, she spoke, each word measured, as if stepping through a minefield. "He listens," she said. "He understands things you don't." That sentence struck deeper than any confession. It wasn't romance he heard in it. It was dependence. The quiet relief of being seen by someone who held all the leverage. "He's in a position of authority," he said. "That matters." "You don't know him," she snapped. "You don't know what he's done for me." "What he's done," he repeated softly. "Or what he's taken?" Her eyes flashed, anger cutting through fear. "You always do this. You decide what's right before you understand what's happening." "Then help me understand," he said. "Tell me his name." She shook her head. "You don't get to pull him into this." "I'm already in it," he replied. That was when she said something that chilled him. "If you say anything," she whispered, "you'll make it worse." "Not if he found out. Not if someone noticed. If you say anything." The warning lingered long after she retreated to her room again, locking the door this time. He stood alone in the hallway, realizing the truth was already buried behind layers of fear and influence. Whatever this relationship was, it thrived in secrecy, and secrecy was never neutral. That night, as he lay awake, one certainty took shape in his mind. This wasn't just an affair. It was a situation designed to stay hidden, protected by walls much thicker than their own. And before he could confront it, before he could protect her, he would need to understand how it had begun. How authority had slipped quietly into intimacy, one closed door at a time. Understanding how it began was harder than uncovering proof. There were no dramatic confessions, no sudden revelations. Only fragments that surfaced when silence grew unbearable. He started noticing the changes in her stories. Small contradictions. A meeting that ran late without explanation. A name never mentioned twice the same way. When he pressed gently, she bristled. When he backed away, she unraveled. It was a pattern that troubled him most. The push and pull of someone caught between loyalty and fear. One evening, after hours of quiet tension, she finally spoke. "I didn't plan this," she said, sitting at the edge of the couch, hands clasped so tightly her knuckles whitened. "It just happened." That was how she framed it. Inevitable, accidental, as if intention played no role at all. She told him about the first meeting, a work-related visit, formal and forgettable at first. He had been attentive, respectful, asked questions no one else did, remembered details she didn't realize she'd shared. In a world where she often felt invisible, he had noticed her. "At first it felt safe," she said. "Like someone important thought I mattered." The word important lingered in the air. Authority, he realized, often arrived disguised as validation. As the weeks passed, their conversations stretched beyond necessity. Messages arrived late at night, always careful, always framed as concern. "Did you get home safely? You seemed stressed today." Nothing explicit, nothing undeniable, just enough to create reliance. "He told me he understood pressure," she said quietly. That people like him had to be careful. That discretion protected everyone. Discretion. Another word that sounded harmless until it wasn't. He listened, his chest tightening as the pieces aligned. This wasn't a sudden crossing of boundaries. It was a slow erosion. Guidance had become expectation. Concern had turned into instruction. Compliments had shifted into control. "Did he ever tell you to keep it secret?" he asked. She hesitated. "He said people wouldn't understand," she replied. "That would ruin things for both of us." There it was, the pivot point, when authority stopped being external and started shaping her choices from within. She described moments that made her uneasy only in hindsight. How he questioned who she spent time with. How he framed his jealousy as worry. How disagreement was met with silence that felt like punishment. But he also helped me, she added quickly, as if afraid of betraying him even now. When I was overwhelmed, he was there. That's how it works, he said, more to himself than to her. She looked up, startled. What? Power doesn't take, he said slowly. It convinces you to give. Her eyes filled, the first crack in the careful defense she'd built. I didn't think it was wrong, she whispered. Not at first. He believed her. That was the cruelest part. The absence of malice didn't erase the damage. It only made it harder to confront. When she retreated to her room that night, he remained where he was, replaying her words. The relationship hadn't begun with desire alone. It had grown from imbalance, experience against vulnerability, authority against trust. And now, whatever it had become, it was no longer contained between them. The next morning, he found her staring at her phone, unread messages lighting the screen. Her hand shook as she turned it face down. He knows something's wrong, she said. Have you told him? He asked. No, she replied. But he'll notice. The realization settled heavily in his chest. If the warden sensed exposure, if he felt control slipping, there was no telling how he would respond. Men accustomed to command rarely surrendered it quietly. As he watched his daughter retreat further into herself, one thought sharpened into resolve. Silence had already caused harm. And if authority had been allowed to become intimate in the dark, then truth, however dangerous, might be the only thing strong enough to break it. He didn't yet know how far that truth would reach. But in the next chapter of their lives, secrecy would no longer be an option. He didn't sleep the night he decided to speak. The house felt different. No longer a shelter, but a waiting room before something irreversible. Every sound carried weight. The ticking clock, the distant traffic, the soft movement behind his daughter's closed door. Silence, once his ally, had turned complicit. By morning, resolve had replaced doubt. He told himself he was doing what any father should. That protection sometimes required confrontation. That institutions existed to correct abuse of power, not conceal it. Belief in systems had guided most of his life, and even now, standing at the edge of consequence, he clung to it. He didn't tell her where he was going. The building was colder than he expected, glass, steel, and a professionalism that felt deliberately impersonal. He spoke carefully, choosing words that carried concern rather than accusation. He asked for guidance. He mentioned boundaries. He used the word relationship instead of affair, hoping restraint would be met with responsibility. The officials listened, nodded, took notes, and then, inevitably, they asked for the name. Saying it aloud felt like breaking a seal. There was a pause, not long enough to be obvious, but long enough to matter. A subtle exchange of looks, a shift in posture. Procedures suddenly replaced empathy. We'll look into it, someone said. These matters are sensitive. Sensitive. Another word that protected more than it exposed. By the time he left, the reassurance he'd expected hadn't come. Instead, a quiet unease followed him out the door, settling into his chest like a warning he didn't yet understand. That evening, his daughter confronted him before he could speak. You went somewhere, she said, her voice tight. It wasn't a question. He didn't deny it. I had to. Her face drained of color. You promised you wouldn't. I promised I'd protect you, he replied. This isn't protection, it's control. She stepped back as if struck. You don't know what you've done. The words echoed the warning she'd given before, but now they carried certainty. Fear had hardened into something sharper. He won't see it that way, she continued. You've embarrassed him. That's not how accountability works, he said. That's how power works, she shot back. Later that night, his phone rang. The voice on the other end was calm, measured, almost courteous. This is the warden, the man said. Not a name, a title, a reminder. There was no apology, no denial, only disappointment, framed as concern. I understand you're worried about your daughter, the voice continued, but involving others was unnecessary. His grip tightened. What's unnecessary is exploiting authority. A pause, then a soft exhale. You misunderstand the situation. No, he replied. I understand it perfectly. The call ended shortly after, without resolution, without threat, and yet the absence of anger was more unsettling than rage would have been. Men who expected obedience didn't raise their voices. They waited. From that moment on, everything shifted. Her phone rang constantly, then stopped altogether. Messages went unanswered. She became withdrawn, watchful, as if bracing for something unseen. When he tried to talk, she accused him of ruining her life, of turning concern into humiliation. You didn't save me, she said one night, tears streaking her face. You exposed me. The words cut deep, lodging where certainty had once lived. Had he mistaken action for protection? Had truth, once released, become its own kind of weapon? Days passed, heavy and unresolved. No official follow-up came. No reassurance. Only silence from those who now knew, and silence from a man who no longer needed to speak. The final crack came quietly. One evening, she didn't come down for dinner. He knocked. No answer. He opened the door to find her sitting on the bed, staring at nothing, her phone dark beside her. He knows, she said flatly. Knows what? He asked. That I can't fix this. A chill ran through him. He sat beside her, reaching out, but she didn't respond. For the first time, doubt overtook resolve. Exposure hadn't ended the situation. It had transformed it. What had once lived in secrecy now existed in tension, and tension demanded resolution. As he lay awake that night, a realization surfaced with terrifying clarity. When truth challenges power, power rarely retreats. It adapts, and somewhere beyond the reach of honesty and intention, consequences were already in motion, quiet, deliberate, and far more dangerous than anything he had imagined. After truth was spoken, nothing settled. It only shifted. The house became a place of careful movement, as if one wrong step might trigger something irreversible. He noticed how she listened now, not to him, but past him. Every sound outside made her tense. Every unfamiliar number on her phone stole her breath, even though the phone itself rarely lit up anymore. She accused him in fragments. You wanted to be right. You didn't listen. You chose your morals over my life. Each sentence landed like a verdict. He tried to explain that protection wasn't control, that silence had already done its damage. But explanations sounded hollow in a space where fear had taken root. What unsettled him most was how she defended the very thing that had hurt her. He cared. She insisted one evening, arms wrapped around herself. He wouldn't let anything happen to me. The certainty in her voice frightened him more than doubt would have. He recognized it now, not love, but conditioning. The need to believe safety still existed somewhere, even if it came at a cost. People like him don't lose, she added quietly. They adjust. That night, he lay awake replaying her words. They adjust. It sounded less like reassurance and more like a warning. Days passed with no official response from the authorities. No follow-up questions. No protective measures. The silence was deafening. What had felt like action now felt like exposure without defense. Truth released into a system that preferred stillness. She stopped eating regularly. Her sleep fractured into short, restless intervals. Once, he found her sitting on the bathroom floor in the early hours, staring at the tiles as if counting them might keep her grounded. He said this would happen, she murmured when she noticed him. Who did? He asked, though he already knew. She didn't answer. Instead, she began pulling away in quieter ways. She packed and unpacked her bag repeatedly, as if preparing for something she couldn't name. She deleted messages, then restored them. She asked odd questions about bus routes, about places he'd never mentioned, about how long it took to drive out of town. Why do you need to know that? He asked once. She shrugged, just wondering. But nothing about her felt casual anymore. One evening, their argument spilled into something raw and unguarded. You think telling the truth fixes things, she said, voice shaking. But all you did was take away my choices. I gave you options, he replied. I gave you a way out. No, she snapped. You took away the only way I knew how to survive this. The word stunned him. Survive, not escape, not heal, endure. He realized then how deeply the situation had reshaped her sense of safety. Exposure hadn't freed her. It had left her suspended between fear and loyalty, with no ground beneath her feet. The next morning, she was unusually calm. Too calm. She made breakfast, asked him if he wanted coffee, smiled in a way that didn't reach her eyes. The normalcy felt staged, as if she were performing a memory of herself. I'm going to clear my head, she said, slipping on her jacket. I won't be long. Do you want me to come with you? He asked. No, she replied gently. I need to do this alone. She kissed his cheek before he could protest. The gesture lingered, unfamiliar and final. Hours passed. By evening, unease settled into certainty. Her phone went straight to voicemail. Messages stayed unread. The sky darkened, and the quiet outside pressed in like a held breath. He stood at the window, watching the street empty, replaying her calm smile over and over again. Only later would he understand it for what it was. Not peace, not relief, but a decision. And as night swallowed the last trace of daylight, one truth surfaced with brutal clarity. After the truth was spoken, she hadn't become safer. She had become unreachable. Unreachable became the longest night of his life. At first, he told himself not to panic. She had asked for space. She had said she wouldn't be long. He replayed her words like a promise, clinging to their simplicity as the clock slipped past the hour she should have returned. He called once, then again. Each time, her phone rang until it surrendered to voicemail. He sent messages he immediately regretted. Where are you? Please call me. The screen remained unchanged, glowing briefly before going dark. Outside, the streetlights flickered on, casting pale circles across the empty road. Every passing car made his heart jump, only to sink again when it continued on without slowing. By 10, worry had hardened into dread. He checked her room. Nothing missing. No pack bag. Her shoes were still by the door. The jacket she wore hung in the closet. Only her keys were gone. The absence felt deliberate, too neat, too quiet. He walked the neighborhood, calling her name under his breath, scanning doorways and bus stops as if she might simply be waiting there, unsure how to come home. The air had turned cold, the kind that settled into bones and refused to leave. People glanced at him with polite indifference, unaware that his world had begun to collapse. At midnight, he returned home and sat at the kitchen table, phone in hand, watching the seconds tick by. His mind replayed every conversation, every warning he had ignored, every moment he had mistaken resolve for protection. When he called again, the line disconnected immediately. Her phone was off. The finality of it hit him like a physical blow. Phones didn't die accidentally, not when someone depended on them. Turning it off was a choice. He drove to the places she sometimes went when she needed to think. The small park by the river, the late-night cafe she loved, the quiet stretch of road overlooking the city lights. Each stop ended the same way. Empty benches, closed doors, unanswered questions. By morning, exhaustion blurred into panic. The sky lightened, indifferent to his fear. He stood in her room, surrounded by familiar objects that suddenly felt like relics. Her bed was neatly made, her laptop untouched. No note, no explanation, just absence. Calling the police felt like crossing another line, one he had hoped never to reach. He hesitated. Phone pressed his ear, haunted by the thought that this, too, might make things worse. But waiting had already failed him. The officer on the other end asked routine questions. Name, age, last known location, time last seen. He answered mechanically, each detail making her disappearance more real. She's an adult, the officer said carefully. Sometimes people leave on their own. She wouldn't do this, he replied. Not without telling me. There was a pause. We'll file a report. It wasn't reassurance. It was procedure. When the police arrived, they moved through the house with quiet efficiency. They asked about stress, about relationships, about recent arguments. He told them the truth, or as much of it as he could, without naming what still felt dangerous to say aloud. When they left, the house felt hollowed out, as if their presence had taken the last illusion of safety with them. He sat alone, staring at the darkened hallway, waiting for footsteps that never came. Hours later, his phone buzzed. A blocked number. His heart pounded as he answered, hope and terror colliding in his chest. There was no voice on the line, only silence, and then a single text appeared. She's not where you can reach her. No signature. No explanation. Just confirmation of what he already feared. His hands shook as he stared at the screen. The message wasn't a demand. It wasn't a threat. It was a statement of control. As the sun dipped below the horizon once more, he realized that the disappearance wasn't an ending. It was a beginning. Whatever had been set in motion by exposure had now taken form. And if he wanted answers, he would have to face something far more terrifying than silence. He would have to confront the system that allowed her to vanish without a trace. Silence settled into the house, like a presence of its own. It wasn't the absence of sound that disturbed him. It was the weight of it. Every unanswered question pressed harder than noise ever could. The walls held memories now sharpened by fear. Her laugh drifting from the kitchen, her footsteps pacing the hallway, the quiet rituals of a life interrupted. The police called it a waiting period. He called it abandonment. Days passed without progress. Officers checked boxes, filled forms, repeated assurances that felt rehearsed. Adults were allowed to disappear. They reminded him. Unless there was evidence of harm, there was little urgency. He listened, nodded, and swallowed the growing certainty that urgency only existed when someone in power demanded it. He replayed the message again and again. She's not where you can reach her. It hadn't come with instructions or demands. That was what made it terrifying. Whoever sent it didn't need leverage. They already had it. He handed the phone to the detective assigned to the case. The man studied the screen, expression unreadable. "Do you know who might have sent this?" the detective asked. He hesitated. There was a name behind that silence, one tied to authority and influence. Saying it aloud felt dangerous, like challenging something designed to withstand scrutiny. "There's someone," he said carefully, "someone with power." The detective's pen paused for just a fraction of a second before moving again. "Power how?" He explained as neutrally as he could. An inappropriate relationship, a position of authority, a conflict of interest. He expected alarm. Instead, he received caution. "These things are complicated," the detective said. "We'll look into all possibilities." The phrase sounded familiar. It carried the same hollow promise as before. As days turned into weeks, the investigation remained surface level. Cameras reviewed showed nothing. Phone records ended abruptly. No witnesses came forward. It was as if she had stepped into a blind spot deliberately engineered to exist. He noticed other things, too. The way questions shifted when certain details arose. How conversations ended sooner than expected. How his calls were returned more slowly once names and titles entered the discussion. Silence, he learned, wasn't passive. It was maintained. One afternoon, a woman knocked on his door, a neighbor he barely knew. She spoke in whispers, glancing over her shoulder as if afraid of being seen. "I don't want trouble," she said, "but I saw her that night." She wasn't alone. His breath caught. Who was with her? The woman shook her head. "I didn't recognize him. But he wasn't from around here." Before he could ask more, she retreated, fear closing the door behind her. That night, he sat alone, connecting fragments. The message, the silence, the subtle resistance from institutions meant to help. This wasn't negligence. It was containment. He began digging on his own. Old news articles, archive complaints, mentions buried in forums and footnotes, whispers of authority misuse, investigations that stalled, names that surfaced briefly and vanished again. Patterns emerged, faint but unmistakable. This wasn't the first time someone had disappeared around power. What unsettled him most wasn't what he found, but what he didn't. Records incomplete. References missing. Stories that ended without conclusion. Erasure. He realized then that silence didn't mean nothing was happening. It meant something was being protected. Late one evening, as he organized notes and timelines across the kitchen table, his phone rang again. This time, the number wasn't blocked. He answered cautiously. "I heard you're asking questions," a voice said, older, restrained, carrying the weight of experience. "Who is this?" he asked. "A friend," the voice replied. "Or someone who used to be." There was a pause, heavy with implication. "Be careful," the voice continued. "Some doors stay locked for a reason." The call ended before he could respond. He stared at the phone, heart pounding, understanding dawning with brutal clarity. Silence wasn't a void, it was a warning system. And the more he pushed against it, the more resistance he would face. But stopping now meant accepting disappearance as an answer. As he gathered the scattered papers, one thought steadied him. If silence was protecting something, then noise, carefully placed, might still crack it. And somewhere, buried beneath fear and institutional quiet, someone else knew the truth. The next chapter of this search would not come from officials or records, but from those who had learned long ago what happened when authority went unquestioned. The more he spoke, the quieter the world became. Doors closed gently. Calls went unanswered. Conversations ended the moment names and titles surfaced. It wasn't confrontation he faced. It was withdrawal, the kind that left no marks but reshaped reality all the same. He began to understand a lesson no one teaches. Truth by itself is not protection. For years, he had believed that exposure corrected imbalance, that wrongdoing, once revealed, naturally led to accountability. It was a comforting belief, built on the idea that systems existed to serve those without power. But now, standing in the wreckage of that faith, he saw how incomplete it had been. Truth without safeguards didn't dismantle power. It alerted it. As he replayed every decision, the moment he spoke out replayed with new clarity. He had gone forward with conviction, not strategy. He had named the threat without shielding the vulnerable. In doing so, he hadn't broken the system. He had stepped into its blind spots. This was the lesson no one taught him as a father or as a citizen. When authority is challenged, it doesn't collapse. It consolidates. He thought of his daughter, not as she was when she left, but as she had been before fear narrowed her world. He wondered how much of her silence had been choice and how much had been survival. Victims, he realized, often protect their abusers not out of loyalty, but because those abusers are convinced them there is no safe alternative. The system mirrored that same psychology. It rewarded discretion. It discouraged disruption. And it taught everyone involved that quiet endurance was safer than open resistance. One evening, while sorting through notes he had gathered, he found himself writing something he hadn't intended. A message, not for investigators or officials, but for himself. Truth must be paired with protection. Exposure without support is abandonment. Power fears scrutiny, but only when it is sustained. He stared at the words, understanding too late what they meant. This was the cost of acting alone. The lesson extended beyond his story. It was a warning to anyone who believed that morality was enough, that righteousness could replace preparation. Systems didn't respond to conscience. They responded to pressure, persistence, and collective voice. Alone, he was noise. Together, people became force. That night, he received another call, the same restrained voice from before. "You're close to things you shouldn't carry by yourself," the voice said. "Then help me," he replied. There was a long pause. "Not directly." "Then how?" "By listening," the voice said. "There are others." People who tried to speak once and learned what it cost. The call ended, but something had shifted. For the first time since her disappearance, he felt direction instead of despair. The lesson no one teaches is learned the hard way. Justice is not automatic. It is constructed, and construction requires witnesses, patterns, and proof that cannot be buried quietly. As he prepared to follow the thread he had been offered, he understood that the next step would not come from exposing a single man, but from uncovering a pattern too large to ignore. Somewhere beyond his grief, beyond fear, there were cracks in the uniform of authority, and if he could find them, silence would no longer be enough to hide what had been done. The first crack appeared where he least expected it, not in a document or a confession, but in a voice that trembled when it shouldn't have. They met in a place designed for anonymity, A small diner just off the highway, fluorescent lights humming overhead, the smell of burned coffee clinging to everything. The man who slid into the booth across from him wore no uniform, but carried its weight anyway. His hands bore faint indentations where a badge once rested. His eyes scanned the room before settling cautiously on the table between them. "You didn't hear this from me," the man said. "I won't hear anything unless you tell me," he replied. That earned a tight, humorless smile. The man introduced himself only by his first name. Years ago, he'd worked under the same warden, long enough to learn the rules that weren't written down. He spoke slowly, choosing each word as if it might be used against him later. "People think power announces itself," he said. "It doesn't. It tests. Small favors. Quiet exceptions. You don't notice until you're already complicit." He described complaints that never made it past internal review. Transfers that happened overnight. Careers that stalled without explanation. Those who asked too many questions learned quickly that survival depended on silence. "Did anyone ever push back?" he asked. The man hesitated. A few tried. "What happened to them?" Another pause. "They left, or they learned." The implications settled heavily between them. He asked about his daughter, not directly, but in fragments. Young women, special attention, mentorships that blurred into something else. The man's jaw tightened. "There were rumors," he admitted. "Always rumors. But rumors don't stand up to authority unless someone higher wants them to. And if they don't, then the uniform closes ranks." He felt the pieces align, not cleanly, but enough to form a picture. The warden was an anomaly. He was a product of an environment that rewarded control and punished disruption. The affair hadn't happened in isolation. It had been enabled. "Did you ever see him scared?" he asked. The man considered the question. "Once, when someone documented everything. Dates, messages, witnesses, not one incident, patterns." "What happened to that person?" The man leaned closer. "They disappeared from the system. Not dead, not gone, just unreachable." The word echoed painfully familiar. When they parted, the man left him with a warning and a name. Another former employee. Someone who had tried to speak years ago and paid for it. The name wasn't in any public record he could find. That, too, felt intentional. The next days were a blur of quiet meetings and guarded conversations. Each person he spoke to revealed a sliver more, a complaint dismissed as misunderstanding. A young staffer who left abruptly, a sealed inquiry no one would discuss. None of it was definitive on its own. Together, it was a pattern. And patterns frightened institutions more than accusations ever could. He began documenting everything, dates, testimonies, inconsistencies. He backed it up in places he hoped would outlive him if necessary. Paranoia crept in, but he welcomed it. Awareness, he'd learned, was a form of defense. Late one night, as he organized notes, his phone buzzed. A message from an unknown number. "You're asking about the wrong things." He stared at the screen, heart pounding. There are consequences for persistence. He typed, deleted, typed again. Finally, he sent nothing. Silence, this time, was strategic. Minutes later, another message appeared. "She trusted you to protect her." The cruelty of it stole his breath. This wasn't intimidation, it was precision. Someone was watching closely enough to weaponize guilt. He set the phone down, hands shaking, and focused on the note spread before him. The cracks were real now. He could see where pressure had been applied to keep the surface intact. Uniforms projected strength, but they relied on compliance, on people believing resistance was futile. That belief was beginning to fracture. As dawn crept through the window, he understood the risk had escalated. He wasn't just seeking answers anymore. He was disrupting balance. And balance, when built on silence, defended itself aggressively. But he also understood something else. He was no longer alone. There were witnesses now. Patterns. Voices that, once connected, could not be dismissed as coincidence. The uniform had cracks, and through them, truth was beginning to show. The next step would demand more than documentation. It would require choosing how and where to release what he had found. Because once the story moved beyond closed doors, there would be no going back. Once the story left closed rooms, It stopped belonging to him. He learned that quickly. The first inquiry didn't come from law enforcement or oversight committees. It came from people advising caution, lawyers who spoke in hypotheticals, advocates who warned about retaliation, journalists who asked for proof strong enough to survive pressure, not just truth strong enough to be believed. Understand this, one of them said gently. Justice isn't just about being right. It's about being prepared to lose. Lose time. Lose privacy. Lose whatever remained of a quiet life. He had already lost his daughter. The evidence he'd gathered was compelling, but incomplete. Patterns, testimonies, corroborations that hinted loudly, but didn't yet scream. The system demanded certainty before action, while protecting those who knew how to exploit doubt. When he finally sat across from an internal review panel, he felt the imbalance immediately. Polite faces, neutral tones, questions framed as concern rather than challenge. Do you have direct proof of coercion? One asked. Not a confession, he replied. But behavior doesn't exist in isolation. That may be, another said, but we operate on standards, not suspicions. Standards, he realized, were another word for thresholds designed to be unreachable. The warden's response arrived through representation, measured, confident, dismissive. The relationship, if it existed at all, had been consensual. Allegations were exaggerated. Grief distorted perception. A father struggling to cope had misinterpreted events. The language was surgical, clean, designed to sound reasonable. He wanted to scream that reason had nothing to do with it, that power reshaped consent, that silence didn't mean safety. But outrage had no place in rooms like these. Emotion weakened credibility. Pain was treated as bias. Afterward, in the hallway, an official pulled him aside. You should consider stepping back, the man said quietly. For your own good. For hers, he asked. The man hesitated. There's no bringing her back this way. The words landed harder than any denial. Justice, it seemed, was more comfortable discussing futures and addressing irreversible pasts. In the days that followed, pressure mounted. Subtle at first, missed callbacks, postponed meetings. Then, sharper, a warning from a lawyer about defamation risks. An anonymous message suggesting he was being watched. Friends urged him to rest, to grieve privately, to accept uncertainty as fate. But acceptance felt like betrayal. One evening, alone in a house that no longer felt like home, he laid everything out on the table, documents, timelines, testimonies. He weighed the cost of continuing against the cost of stopping. Stopping meant safety, relative anonymity, the ability to sleep without listening for every sound. Continuing meant exposure, risk, the possibility that nothing would change anyway. Justice, he understood now, was not a destination. It was a transaction, and the price was always higher for those without power. His phone buzzed with a message from one of the journalists. If you go public, you need to be ready. This won't end cleanly. He typed a response, erased it, then typed again. I'm already living with what didn't end cleanly. He sent the files. The moment felt oddly quiet. No release, no triumph. Just the steady hum of consequence approaching. Later that night, as he stood in his daughter's room, he noticed something he hadn't before. Tucked behind a book on the shelf was a folded piece of paper. Not a note, just a list. Dates, times, names written in her handwriting. Evidence. His chest tightened as he realized what it meant. She had been preparing, documenting, protecting herself in the only way she knew how. And she had trusted him. Too late to finish what she'd started. As dawn broke, casting pale light across the room, he understood the final cost of justice. It demanded patience when grief wanted urgency, courage when fear begged for silence, and the willingness to live without closure. The story was out now. The system would respond as it always did, slowly, defensively, strategically. But somewhere in the widening space between denial and exposure, consequences were forming, and whether they led to truth or only more questions would be decided in what came next. After the story broke, the world expected an ending. He did too. But endings were for narratives that obeyed rules. For cases with bodies, confessions, verdicts neatly delivered. What followed instead was something quieter, harder to carry. Investigations were announced, then delayed. Statements were issued, carefully worded and cautiously empty. The warden stepped aside, temporarily, his absence framed as procedural, not punitive. No charges were filed, no answer confirmed, and his daughter remained missing. Time rearranged itself after that. Days blurred into weeks, weeks into an existence measured by small rituals. Checking his phone before sleep, scanning crowds without realizing he was doing it, listening for footsteps that never came. Hope didn't disappear. It thinned, stretched between logic and longing. People stopped asking how he was. They assumed survival meant healing. He learned to live inside questions. Where had she gone? Had she chosen disappearance? Or had it been chosen for her? Was she still alive somewhere, adapting the way he'd been told power always did? Some nights, he imagined her watching from a distance, waiting until it was safe. Other nights, the silence felt permanent, heavy with implication. Both possibilities hurt in different ways. The system moved on. Reports concluded with phrases like insufficient evidence and ongoing review. Files were archived. Attention drifted. The story, once sharp enough to cut, dulled into a cautionary headline remembered vaguely by those who hadn't lived it. But he didn't forget. He kept her list, the dates, the names, sealed in a folder, backed up and stored where it couldn't vanish quietly. It became less about justice now and more about witness. If nothing else, her existence would not be erased. Sometimes he spoke at small gatherings, rooms filled with people who understood power's quiet violence. Parents, survivors, whistleblowers who carried the same hollow certainty that truth alone was never enough. He didn't tell them how the story ended. He told them what it cost. One mistake, he would say, voice steady despite everything. We think exposure is protection. It's not. Protection has to come first. They listened. Some nodded. Some cried. A few took notes, as if preparing themselves for battles they hoped never to fight. At home, her room stayed the same. Not preserved, not abandoned, simply waiting. Dusk gathered where life had paused. He refused to decide what that meant. On the anniversary of her disappearance, he returned to the place where everything had begun. The quiet street, the familiar door, the ordinary night that fractured into years of uncertainty. He stood there longer than necessary, letting the questions exist without answers. Because answers, he had learned, were not always the point. Some truths live between certainty and denial, between memory and evidence, between what could be proven and what could only be known by those who felt it. His daughter existed there now, between questions, not a headline, not a case number, not a lesson, though one emerged from her absence. She was a life shaped by power, by silence, by a system that preferred order over accountability. And though her fate remained unresolved, her story had done something the system could not undo. It had been told. As he turned away, the way of it followed him, not as closure, but as purpose. He didn't know if justice would ever arrive. He no longer expected it to look the way he once imagined. But as long as her name was spoken, as long as the questions remained unanswered and uncomfortable, disappearance would not mean erasure. And in that fragile space between doubt and determination, she endured.